So some of you may know about the work of ECCR, but for those of you who don't, a very brief introduction. ECCR stands for the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, and we were established about 30 years ago and have brought churches, faith groups and religious orders together on campaigns and around advocacy around how businesses behave in the world. Our vision is to see money used in a way that creates a fairer and more sustainable world. And we do this primarily through two programs. First of all, our Money Makes Change program, and second of all, through our program ShareAction for Tax Justice. So Money Makes Change is a program and set of resources to help Christians explore and make ethical choices around money. We want to open up conversations around how we spend, save and invest, and inspire action to create a fairer world through our finances. Imagine what a difference we could make if every Christian chose to bank with an ethical bank and invested their pension and savings in companies working to better our planet. And ShareAction for Tax Justice is a program that seeks to raise awareness in churches of the importance of tax justice, to campaign for a fairer, greener tax system, and to encourage Christians and all faith organizations to promote tax justice through their work. We focus on campaigning, advocacy, and education, and want to see a tax system that serves the common good. More specifically, we seek an end to tax dodging and the implementation of tax policies which address poverty and inequality. Now, the COVID-19 crisis has created a deficit of hope as people worry about their health, jobs, and finance. And as a team at ECCR, we were inspired to put on a series of online events over the week called Restoring Hope, exploring the relevance of the Christian faith to our financial decisions and the wider economy, and in the process helping us to rediscover hope in these challenging times. So I'm delighted that we've been joined tonight by Michael Kine from ShareAction. ShareAction is a charity that has spent the last 15 years building a movement for responsible investment. They believe that the investment system can be a force for good if decisions are made openly and with more than short-term profit in mind. They're on a mission to transform the investment system and unlock its potential to be a force for good. And Michael leads their work engaging with people about the impact of the financial system and their stake in it, building tools to educate and support them to take action. He has led the development and launch of their Pension Power program last year, which is one of ShareAction's projects to help educate and encourage people as to the power of their pensions to bring about change, and then give people the tools to take positive action. So now over to you, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Janie. It's really great to meet you all, and looking forward to this next hour. So I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me just for one moment while I do this. And just while I do that, so as Janie said, my name is Michael, and I work for a charity called ShareAction. Our mission as a charity is for all finance to power social progress. And what that means is that, you know, at the moment, a lot of the kind of decisions that are made within the kind of mainstream economy and financial system are based on short-term profit. But we think there should be lots of other issues that are taken into account there. So we work on a number of kind of campaigns, from climate to workforce practices and food and health. And we try and make sure that people making decisions within the financial system think of those things as well as short-term profit. And we apply pressure in a lot of different places. And one of the things that we do is work with individual people to help them understand what they can do. And one of the ways that we do that is by running workshops and trainings. And one of the trainings that we run is on pensions, which is what I'm doing now. So just before I start, I thought I'd share a little bit of information about why this is important to me. So for a long time, I was quite worried about the climate crisis and trying to make a positive difference. One of the key ways that I thought I could do that was by making conscious consumer choices. So when I went to the supermarket, I wouldn't buy specific products, for example. I then found out that my pension was invested in companies and often invested in the companies whose very products I was trying to avoid when I went to the supermarket to try and affect change. And that felt really quite jarring, and it felt quite undermined, I guess, which kind of made me interested in this topic. Cool. And then the last quick note just at the beginning is that I'm absolutely not qualified to give you any financial advice. This is just an introduction to the topic and an overview of some of the kind of content, so please don't go and make any decisions just off the back of what I've said. Please just use this as kind of introductory information. Cool. And just at the outset, I wanted to do a couple of quick polls, which I've put up, and they're just questions to kind of gauge your knowledge at this point. And there's two kind of reasons why I'm doing this. One, it's helpful for me to see at the end when we'll do these polls again, kind of how much you've learnt. But I think it's also a useful self-reflection tool to kind of take stock at the beginning of a session and think about how much we know about a certain topic, and then take stock again at the end to see where we're at. So I'm just going to flash up 3 polls very quickly, and they're on a scale of 1 to 10. So if you click 1, you're saying, I know very little about this topic. And if you're saying 10, you're in effect saying, I could talk about this topic at length. So kind of place yourself on that scale. So the first question, which should be coming up now, is on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you understand the impact pension investments have on the world around us? So just take a couple of seconds, pop down where you think you are there. We'll just fly through these. It's quite common for people to know very, very little. It's not a topic that many people know about, so it's okay if you're towards the bottom end. Great, most people have voted there, so we'll end that one. And we have quite a good split actually, so that's good to know. I'll do the second one now. They're slightly similar, the questions, but they're slightly different as well. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you understand the impact your pension investments are having on the world around us? So about your money in particular, as opposed to kind of pensions in general. I'll just give you a few seconds there again. Great, thanks everyone. And I'll just do the last one now, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you understand the impact your pension investments could have on the world around us if they were invested differently? Brilliant, thanks everyone for doing that. And now we've done all the introductory things, we'll go on into the presentation itself. Just before we start, something I like to ask people as a kind of provocative question, I guess, is to put your hand up, which is far easier in person, if you think you own shares in BP. So I think there's a reactions box that's on the kind of Zoom toolbar, and you can kind of wave your hand if you think that's the case. So if you think you own shares in BP, wave that or put your thumbs up. A few people have put in their thumbs up. Cool. So 2, 3 people have done so. That's interesting for me, and we'll come back to that later on. Sorry if that's a little bit cryptic for now. Great. So whenever we talk about pensions, or whenever perhaps you've talked about pensions or received kind of literature around the topic of pensions, there might have been an image like this. It's often a picture of people who have retired on a beach living out an ideal retirement. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that commonly when we talk about pensions, they're understood solely in terms of retirement income. That's really the only way we think about pensions. But at ShareAction, we really like to point out that that isn't the case. We think there's far more to pensions than just preparing us for our retirement. And we like to point out that when we pay into our pensions every month, what actually happens is that that money is invested in companies, and primarily in company shares. So it's not just sitting in a kind of bank vault in Switzerland, which is funnily enough what most people think. It's literally being invested in companies every month. And while your kind of individual pension pot might not feel all that significant, so you may not have all that much money in your pension pot, collectively our pensions have huge power. nearly half of all the investments made in the UK and globally actually come from our pensions. So when you hear about kind of investors in the financial system, it's not just kind of hedge funds or bankers whose money it is that's kind of flowing around the system. A lot of it is actually our money. And at ShareAction, we think that's actually a really great thing, because the economy and the financial system is often really poorly understood, and it can feel really hard to understand how we can use it as a vehicle for change. But actually, because it's our money, it gives us an in, and we think that's really great. And companies are really, really dependent on investment from our pension providers to kind of go about their day-to-day business and finance new projects. So we like to kind of use the phrase that our pensions build the world around us right now, in addition to preparing us for retirement. There's a kind of very important point of our pensions in giving us financial security in retirement, but they play a very fundamental role in kind of funding companies and constructing the fabric of the world that we engage with right now. So a quick activity for you all at the start. So I'd like you to think about, it's trickier now because we don't have normal days anymore, but think about a typical day that you might have. And I'd like you to just think about the different products and services that you've come into contact with, and think about which of those might have been funded by your pension. And just think about that for about 10 seconds. And then if you could just post in the chat an example of something that you're thinking about, that you've interacted with or consumed that you think your pension might have had a hand in funding, that would be really great. Hopefully that was clear, but if not, do let me know. Alcohol, says Kenneth. Very true. It's definitely something that our pensions are invested in. Electricity, Royal Mail, almost everything. Yeah, we're kind of getting at the point I'm trying to make, which is that our pensions are pretty much invested in everything that we interact with. And we like to talk about this very much. We like to give the example of talking about this through the course of our day. So from the tea you drink in the morning, to the train station that you may commute into, or to the television that you watch at night, our pensions are probably invested in all of these things. Bottom left is King's Cross train station, the redevelopment for which was entirely funded by a pension scheme. So our pensions really do have a hand in a lot of the things that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, which we think is really interesting. And I'd just like to reiterate the point I made about our pensions having a lot of power. So the kind of stat on the right here, I've said that already, that kind of all the investments in the UK, made in the UK, nearly half come from our pension savings. And the other one I'd like to point out is the one on the left, which makes the point that there is more money in our collective pensions than there is the kind of total value of GDP in this country. And to kind of break that down, we're basically saying that there's more money in our pensions than the total value of literally everything produced in this country over the course of a year, which is a huge amount of money. So yeah, taking stock for now, our pensions aren't just about retirement, they're about the present, and they're really powerful in constructing that present. I've mentioned company shares already as something that our pensions are invested in. And for those of you who aren't clear what company shares are, they are when companies, they essentially like divide the ownership of their company up into lots of different pieces, and you can kind of buy one of these pieces, which is called a company share, and that kind of goes up and down in value as time passes, as more and more people kind of decide whether they think a company is going to be successful or not, or profitable or not. And you can trade that in the future. So if you buy a share at 10p and the company does well and it suddenly ends up at 15p, you can sell that for a profit. And the other type of thing that a pension invests in is called a bond, which is basically a loan. But the example I like to give to talk that through is, say you're a company who builds bridges, You want to build a bridge, but you haven't got the money to do it right now, but you know that in the future you're going to charge everyone who crosses that bridge £2 to cross it. So you know you've kind of got a steady income stream in the future. So you can say to someone who's going to lend you money, like a pension provider, please give me this money now, I can pay it back in the future at this rate, because I know that I've got this guaranteed source of income in the future. So these are the kind of two main types of investments that a pension provider invests in. And there are a few more, like real estate and currency, but they're the two main ones. And kind of over time, your pension will be invested more in bonds because they're generally viewed as a kind of safer investment, because you don't want your kind of pension value fluctuating up and down loads as you near retirement, which often happens with company shares. As I'm sure you might have seen this year from the news and the kind of the way the stock market tumbled as the impact of coronavirus was felt. I should also say there's a lot of jargon in this world of the financial system and pensions, so trying to explain it as I go, but if there's anything that's not clear, please do say and I can answer that. Grand. So what power do our pensions actually have? So I think there's a bit of a leap to be made between understanding that there's a lot of money in our pensions and actually understanding how that translates into influence in the real world. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time explaining that because I think that's really useful to understand. And bear with me on this slide. I'll come around to explaining the pizza in a second. But it's important as a starting point to know that, so we have an individual pension, all of us, or most of us, and that is managed by some type of organisation called a pension provider, or a pension fund, or a pension scheme. You get lots of different words thrown around, but they all essentially mean the same thing. They're an organisation who manages money on behalf of often millions of pension savers. And they can exercise two main powers, and they are called asset selection and engagement. And I'll kind of go into both of those now. So asset selection is where this pizza metaphor comes in. And what it means is essentially deciding where to invest the money that you've got. So you're managing money on behalf of 1 million people. You might have millions and millions and billions of pounds to invest. Like, which companies do you decide to invest the money in? And which do you decide not to invest the money in? And this metaphor of pizza essentially says that when you're deciding where to invest your money, you first choose your base. You decide what's not going on the pizza, what's not going in your investment portfolio. And that might include things like fossil fuel companies, may include things like tobacco companies, kind of controversial sectors, usually or sometimes don't end up in the kind of pension investment portfolio. And then you choose your toppings and decide which specific sectors you want to target. And that might be companies who perform really well financially, because ultimately you're investing in things to appreciate the retirement pot that you've got and help it gain in value. But it might also be companies or sectors that are achieving specific kind of social good in the world. For example, kind of renewable energy companies. And then the second power that our pension providers have is called engagement, and it's a bit less well understood, but at ShareAction we think it's really powerful and really important. And it essentially explains why sometimes your pensions might be, or your pension might be invested in a company who you don't like. So hence the question about BP. Sometimes our pensions are invested in BP. And the reason for that might be that your pension provider may be trying to use the stake it has in owning BP, because when you buy company shares, you own a company or a part of a company to try and change what that company is doing from the inside. And there's a range of different ways that pension providers can try and do that, from kind of writing letters to company chairs, to attending the annual general meetings of companies and asking questions, to doing things that are a bit more forceful. So lots of shareholders and investors can get together and file what are called shareholder resolutions, which are essentially votes at company AGMs. If they pass, they force a company to do something. So last year there was a big shareholder resolution at Barclays, who were the biggest financer of fossil fuels among all European banks. And there was a shareholder proposal filed by lots of pension providers and voted on by lots of pension providers, asking them to stop funding fossil fuel companies. So there's kind of different ways your pension providers can affect change on your behalf, either by kind of avoiding companies and saying, you know what, we're not going to finance you because we don't think you have a place in the world, so go and find money elsewhere, or don't if there's no one else who's willing to finance you. Or you can try and use the stake you have as an owner of that company to try and affect change there. And that's often, these two tactics and strategies are often presented as a bit of a choice. We don't really think that's the case. They're kind of two separate, interlinked ways to create change. You can often kind of say you're going to remove your funding without actually doing it as a kind of threat. And it really does depend on the type of investor that you are as well. If you're a huge pension provider, for example, with say 1 million shares in BP, the potential impact of you sitting down with BP and voting against BP at their AGM, it is potentially huge. So you really have got quite a large stake within the company that you can use to create change. But if you're a smaller investor, say a university, for example, who have less money, but a lot of kind of social and cultural capital, the kind of impact of saying, you know what, we're going to take our money out of the fossil fuel industry because we don't think it has a place in our world, can kind of create social change and kind of feed into narratives, political narratives around what is appropriate and not appropriate. So different strategies worth being aware of. Cool. Next bit is on trying to understand kind of what world your specific pension is building and kind of what your pension is invested in. So I'm very conscious that people on this call, on this webinar, will have different pension providers. So I can't do a kind of deep dive into all of your pension providers and tell you exactly what they're doing. But as a kind of compromise, I'm going to have a look at and kind of share some information on Nest, who are the kind of most popular and most used pension provider in the UK. And I think from the responses you gave to Janie when signing up for this event, that's the pension provider who most of you have a pension with, or the highest number of you have a pension with. So hopefully it'll be useful, and I'll kind of touch on how to find out about your specific pension as well if you're not with Nest, but hopefully it should give a good overview as well. So it's so we'll talk through this because there's quite a lot of content on this slide, but essentially when you pay your money into a pension or give your money to a pension provider to look after, they put you into a fund. It's kind of a pool of people's money, a pool of lots of different people's money that's invested in the same way. And most people will get put in what's called a default fund, which you just automatically get put into, and you have to choose to go out of it. And if we kind of break down this slide, on the left-hand side, you see that in terms of asset allocation, you have most of the pension being invested in equities, which is another name for company shares. It means the same thing. Kind of about 60% there, and about 20%, 20 to 40% in other types of investments like bonds. And because pensions are usually kind of long-term investment, you tend to put more of the assets or more of the money into riskier types of investments like company shares, because over, say, a 40-year period, the risk pays off and you get more of a return from that. But as I said earlier on as well, as you get closer to retirement, your pension provider will slowly and subtly move your money into safer investments like bonds. So you're not suddenly seeing a dip in your retirement value as you approach retirement. And if you look at the top 10 companies, and this is quite representative of most pension funds held within the Nest default fund, you see a lot of the biggest companies that we have in our society today. So tech companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook, banks like JP Morgan, and electronics companies like Samsung. And in the past, it's worth saying, pre-coronavirus, You will have often seen oil and gas companies, particularly BP and Shell, in this top 10, but they've done really badly throughout the pandemic. So they've kind of been taken out of a lot of the portfolios of the kind of investment of them in them has been reduced because they've just done really poorly financially. And in terms of engagement, Nest are actually a pension provider who do a really good job on engagement. We rank pension providers and we think they're the kind of best when it comes to this, on really actively engaging with companies and trying to get them to change. But it's worth saying as well that we think Nest are one of the only mainstream pension providers who really do a very good job of this. The Church of England pension scheme are another one. So that's kind of an overview of kind of what I guess an average pension tends to be invested in. And often people aren't very happy about this because many of these companies have a lot of kind of ethical question marks next to them. So people often want to do something about this. And there's a range of things that you can do, which I'll just jump into now, just to give an overview. So what can you do? So it's worth saying at this point that different people end up in different types of pension schemes, and that means you have different kind of actions available to you. Sadly, it's quite a complex world, so it's not all very straightforward. If you're in, so there's two types of pension schemes, one called a defined contribution scheme and one called a defined benefit scheme. If you're in a defined contribution scheme, you can switch between funds. So as I just mentioned, you get put into a default fund, but you have the option to kind of move around and pick ones that might suit your values more. If you're in a defined benefit scheme, you don't have that option, sadly, but there are other things that you can do. And as a general rule of thumb, if you're over the age of 40 and have been working somewhere or have been working somewhere for over 10 years or so, you're likely to be in a defined benefit scheme. If you're younger and are new to a job, you're likely to be in a defined contribution scheme. There's so much jargon, it's horrifying, but hopefully that's relatively clear. Grand. And if you're in a defined contribution scheme, as I mentioned, you have the option to move between funds. So what I'm going to do really quickly is just flash up some similar information on one of the ethical funds that you can move into if you're with Nest. So some of the more controversial companies get taken out, although there's definitely some controversial companies still in here. And you tend to get companies who are kind of science companies, technology companies represented more. And in some of the ethical funds that you see, you kind of get investments in train companies and train lines and that type of thing. So they tend to be a kind of, I guess, a more accurate representation of where some people's values are at. So it's possible with some pension providers, if you're in a defined contribution scheme, to switch to a fund that might be more in line with your values. And another example of this is this fund, which is with an Aviva, with the Aviva pension. And I just flag this quickly because on the left-hand side, under asset allocation, you'll see that there aren't any investment in bonds. There's a much higher percentage of the investments are in company shares, and that sometimes happens with ethical funds because kind of ethical investment is quite a new thing. So they've kind of sometimes yet to fully apply it across all the types of kind of investments that you can have. So you sometimes get ethical funds just invested in company shares, which does make them a bit riskier. It's just worth bearing in mind. But I don't want to dwell on these too much because I know we've got people who are in different types of pension schemes, and there's lots of different things that you can do. I like to use this slide of this kind of frustrated looking dog because at this point people sometimes do feel quite frustrated. Some of the companies in those ethical funds, they aren't brilliant. Coca-Cola were in the previous one, and I think we still had Google or Microsoft and Apple rather in the one before that. And some of those companies still aren't all that great. So it's easy to kind of feel frustrated. And I guess another point is that it can be quite daunting to change funds and move your money around, because, you know, we're talking about your pension, it's your future life, or your, you know, it may also be a retirement pot that you're currently drawing on, and there's a lot of risk associated with moving money around, so it doesn't necessarily always feel like the right thing to do. So there are other things that you can do as well that we'll come to in a moment. But given that we've not looked at everyone's specific pension, there's a couple of things you can do to find out more about your own pension. So first of all, if you don't know who your pension provider is, to find out, there's a government tool which you can Google where you can type in your employer and it will tell you who your pension provider is, and find out what type of pension scheme you're in. If you're in a defined contribution scheme, you have fund choices that you can move between. So understanding that should give you a good sense of kind of what options you have available to you. And you can find that out usually by visiting your pension provider's website or speaking to kind of HR or ops departments with your employer. Most pension providers provide what are called fund fact sheets, which I took the screenshots from earlier on, which kind of give an overview of where your money is invested. And each pension provider will have slightly different ways in which you can choose to switch between funds. So it might be on an online portal, you might have to write a letter. It kind of varies depending on the provider, so you do need to get to the bottom of that. There are lots of things to think about if you're thinking about doing that. For example, risk. So if an ethical fund that you're thinking of moving your money into is mainly just invested in company shares, like that last one I've showed up, that's a riskier investment because, you know, the market value of companies does fluctuate, and often that's purely human psychology that determines how much people think a company is worth. So one day it might be worth kind of £100, the next day it might be worth 50, and if your pension's not invested in safer investments, the kind of hit to your pension pot from a stock market crash or from kind of poor performance will be quite significant. Costs important to think about as well. Some ethical funds are more expensive. There's a lot more work that has to go into an ethical fund from a pension provider because they have to analyze companies and decide whether they're ethical or not. So the kind of annual charge on your pension, which the pension provider charges you, will be slightly higher. Obviously, think about what the fund's invested in. Think about how it's performed financially over the past kind of 5 years. You know, your pension is there to prepare you for retirement as well, so it's all well and good aligning with your values, but it's also important to think about how it's preparing you for retirement and whether it's doing that effectively. And think about your age and kind of where you're at in your life, because yeah, switching to a kind of riskier pension portfolio or pension fund might not be the best thing to do if you're approaching retirement, but it might be a great thing to do if you're in your early 20s and have got 40 years to kind of bear that risk. Cool. And then there's a couple of other things that I just flag as things you can do. So the first thing I'll say is there's a piece of legislation currently going through Parliament called the Pension Schemes Bill, which was originally a piece of legislation which had very little to do with pensions, with sustainability and climate and workers' rights and that type of thing. But there's a kind of coalition of campaigning organisations like ShareAction lobbying for there to be amendments put in place about kind of the impact of our pensions on issues like the climate crisis. And we've built an online tool that allows you to email your MP to ask them to think about that and attend the debate. And you can find that on our website. That's a great thing to do if you're kind of concerned about actually moving your money, but you want to do something with your pension and ensure that your pension's having a positive impact. Another thing you can do is speak to your employer. So ultimately, it's your employer who chooses which pension provider you have. You can kind of move around within the specific funds the pension provider gives you sometimes, but ultimately it's your employer who chooses the pension provider. So if you think all the funds are terrible, or you don't have any other funds and you think that's not good enough, speaking to your employer and understanding whether they're about to review their pension provider and kind of kind of perhaps starting a kind of internal campaign to get them to choose an ethical pension provider is something that you could do. You can stay connected to ShareAction. You can sign up on our website to stay in the loop, because we run lots of campaigns at specific moments throughout the year that give you the chance to take action. And if you want to learn more, we've got a kind of online microsite called our Pension Power platform at shareaction.org/pensions, where you can learn more and kind of understand more about your pension and the actions that you can take. Now, I'm conscious that I've been talking for a very long time, so I'm going to open it up to questions now. And if you could post any questions you might have in the chat box, that would be grand. And I'll read the questions out that you posted in there, and answer questions as much as I can. And we think we've got about 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll do the polls again at the end, just to kind of reflect on how far you've come. So yeah, any questions that you might have, please do put them in the chat. And I'll just give you a minute to type any up that you have. Cool. We had one question earlier on from Colin, who said, BP announced a strategic move towards renewable energy and their share price dropped dramatically. A pension fund invested in them would see a large loss, which conflicts with their obligations to their members. So people invested in their scheme, in the pension scheme, because the pension scheme has an obligation to the members to make sure their pension pot accumulates in value rather than drops in value. The question is, should they invest to engage? Should pension providers invest in BP to engage? And I think we think yes, absolutely. It's really important to engage with companies and invest with them to try and change what they're doing. I think there comes a point where sometimes companies just refuse to engage with their investors, like their pension providers, and just kind of basically spell out that they're not going to make the changes that people are asking of them. And at that point, we really do think it's the time at which you should kind of divest from companies and pull your funding. But we think pension providers have potentially a huge seat at the table because they have so many shares that they really can affect change. And it's a shame that BP's share price dropped after they announced their move towards renewable energy. That's not what we'd like to see, really. I'm not sure if that was the only kind of causal factor. I think kind of the impact of coronavirus and a lot of airlines not being able to function properly meant there was a kind of reduced demand for oil, which probably also impacted that. But generally, we would say it's really important for pension providers to try and engage with companies to try and change what they're doing. Cool. There's a question from David, which is, what are the particular companies that ShareAction are monitoring or investigating at the moment? So a range of companies. We're running a campaign on banking. So we campaigned on Barclays. We worked on the shareholder resolution I mentioned last year. And we're looking at HSBC this year because they're the kind of second worst bank when it comes to climate financing. We focus on a whole host of companies, and we have different campaigns that focus on different companies. So our food and health campaign is looking at Tesco at the moment, because a lot of the kind of produce that they put out there is unhealthy, and we're trying to encourage pension providers in their investments to think about that. There's a question from Julia, which is, I'm in an NHS pension scheme. I'm not sure if it's invested specifically or is used to fund those that are currently retired. So this is a really good point, in that some pension schemes, specifically civil service pension scheme, the NHS pension scheme, and the teachers pension, they're not actually invested. They're paid out of national insurance. So if you've got a pension with the NHS or as a teacher, your pension won't actually be invested. You're in the small minority where that isn't the case. But you can still do things like write to your MP, because generally you can still, as a constituent, say, I'm concerned about the impact our pensions collectively are having in the world, and I'd like to see them have a more positive impact. Jenny has a question, which I think is a great question, whether there's any useful websites or sources of information to recommend how ethical companies are. And yeah, some of the companies that came up when I looked at those, when I showed you those funds earlier on, if we just scroll back really quickly, like a lot of them, like we probably like won't know the names of, or we won't know who they are, like Gamma Communications or Roper Technologies here. They're kind of not necessarily in the public eye, so it's hard to know whether they're companies that are doing well kind of on sustainability or on that kind of thing or not. What I'd encourage you to do is to Google the name of the company and then ESG. ESG is a kind of industry term, which stands for environment, social and governance, which is kind of used to kind of rate a company and analyze them on how they're doing on environmental and social issues. So if you Google that, there's usually a wealth of information that should come up on kind of how that company does on those things. And then Colin asks or says, is it worth discussing corporate pension schemes and local government pension schemes? South Yorkshire local government pension scheme recently divested from fossil fuels as a result of lobbying from members. It's a really good point again. So you have lots of local authorities have pension schemes for kind of council staff, and they're some of the most progressive in the UK. And there's a lot of campaigns within these pension providers and from campaign groups like Friends of the Earth, trying to encourage these pension providers to divest and take their money out of fossil fuels. Some have been more successful than others, and yeah, there have been some divestment commitments, which is very exciting, which kind of falls under the kind of asset allocation kind of power that I was talking about. But there's also local government schemes who really try and engage with companies as well. And I believe Brunel, for kind of their kind of organisation that's a kind of lots of different local council pension schemes kind of fall under the umbrella of the Brunel pension scheme, and they helped file this resolution at Barclays last year. So there's lots of different examples of these schemes, both choosing where to invest their money and kind of taking action when their money is invested. And yeah, so Dick similarly says other examples of people within local government schemes in a kind of collective way lobbying. And so yeah, that does happen, and it tends to happen better with kind of local government pension schemes because kind of the scheme is kind of viewed as kind of accountable to its local population and the kind of employees there. And because councils often have kind of climate commitments, it's kind of very easy to point out the contradictions between kind of what councils say and how their pensions are invested. When it comes to bigger pension schemes, some of the bigger kind of national ones like Aviva or Legal and General, it tends to be harder to have these kind of member campaigns to change kind of how the kind of scheme's money is invested, because the schemes just have millions of members. So even if you get 50 people together to ask them to do something, they would probably turn around to you and say that you're not kind of representative of the member base as a whole. That's sadly been our experience, which is why we try and provide a kind of range of actions for people to take. Cool. I think that's all the questions that we've had. I'll put those polls up again in a second so we can just have a think about how much we learned and kind of reflect on that. But I'll just give another 30 seconds for questions in case anyone's got any final ones. Okay, it doesn't seem like anyone else has got any more questions. Oh, just one that's come through from Claire, which I'll answer quickly. So Claire asked, do you have any info research about how Nest is good in making demands of the companies it invests in? So yeah, it's harder to find out how a company is kind of being good at engaging companies than it is to kind of find out how kind of what they're investing in. There's a couple of ways to do that. So we have reports which look at how the kind of asset managers for another organization who what they do is they manage the kind of investments on behalf of pension providers, how they do when it comes to kind of voting at AGMs on kind of company resolutions. So you can look at those reports and look at how your pensions asset manager has done on that. And the other way to do it is by looking up specific votes, like the Barclays resolution, and kind of Googling your pension provider and then that resolution, and they should have declared how they voted on that resolution. So that's a good way to kind of gauge whether they're making demands of companies or not. And you have kind of bellwether votes like the Barclays one, that indicate whether your pension provider is doing that or not. Cool. I'm just going to put those polls up again now because we're coming to the end of our time. So on a scale of 1 to 10 again, how much do you understand the impact of pension investments on the world around us? And this is just pension investments generally. Please to be honest, it's useful for me, even if you say you've learned very little, to take that away with me. We'll just give you a couple of seconds to answer that poll. Grand, most of you have voted now, so I will end that poll and move on to the next one, which is about your specific pension investments. So how much do you understand the impact your pension investments are having on the world around us? And I'm conscious we haven't gone into everyone's pension tonight, so maybe that you know less about this one, but it's something to take away with you, perhaps. Great, and then the last one we'll do, which we'll launch now, is on a scale of 1 to 10. How much do you understand the impact your pension investments could have on the world around us if invested differently? And yeah, hopefully this is a useful exercise for all of you as well to kind of see how much you've learned from this evening as well. And I'm going to hand back to Janie now. Stop sharing my screen, but it's been really great talking to you all, and please do get in touch if you've got any feedback or any further questions. We're happy to answer any follow-ups you might have.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Michael. And that was really interesting and great to hear how we can take positive action when it comes to our pensions. So just before we finish this evening, just obviously a huge thank you to Michael for his thoughts. I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's been a really fascinating evening exploring this important topic. Just a few other thoughts from me before we close for this evening. If you're interested in exploring this topic, I'm just going to share my screen here. Just bear with me 1 second. So if you're interested in exploring this topic of pensions, perhaps with your church, you may be interested in using our interactive workshop resource, which is available for free on our website. This is the little booklet here, and there's also a PDF version that you can use. The workshop's designed to be accessible for people exploring connections between faith and finance, either for the first time or for those who want to move from reflection to action. And the workshop resource is made up of conversations that last between 15 and 45 minutes. And conversation 4 is all about pensions and ideas for actions. As Michael's mentioned, you may also find ShareAction's Pension Power website really helpful as you explore this topic further. And just before we end with a closing prayer together, I'd like to highlight that ECCR is a registered charity. We're entirely reliant on donations, and all of our resources, our Money Makes Change resources, are free for individuals and churches to use. And our Restoring Hope series of online events has also been put on for free of charge to participants. And so we really hope you've been inspired, blessed, or challenged by what you've heard tonight, and perhaps you might consider contributing towards the cost of putting on these events or creating these resources. A small donation from every participant will really go a long way and help a small charity like us tremendously. So if you'd like to give, there's a number of really easy ways to do so. There's more information on the slide now. You can, there you go. There's a number of ways you can donate via donor box, which is how you can give through credit card or debit card. The link there is on the screen. There's options to donate £5, £10, £20, or any amount that you like to give. It's really quick and easy, and there's an option to mark your donation as eligible for gift aid. You can also text ECCR followed by a number indicating the amount you'd like to give to the number on the screen. For example, if you text ECCR 5, you'll be donating £5, or if you text ECCR 3, you'll be donating £3. And if you consider making a regular monthly contribution to our work, we'd be so grateful. Our bank details are on the slide, and if you're eligible for gift aid, you can download a form from our website or contact us, and we'd be happy to send one to you to complete. We can only continue this important work and host events like these if we have the resources to do so. So any contributions are gratefully received and go a long way. And just to also let you know that we still have tickets available for some of the other Restoring Hope events happening later this week. On Wednesday evening, we'll be hosting an evening in conversation with Dr. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, and Dr. Ruth Valerio, Tier Fund's Global Advocacy and Influencing Director. We'll be discussing all things faith and finance. And then on Thursday evening, Rosie Venner, our Money Makes Change Program Manager, and myself will be hosting a seminar looking at how churches might consider their financial footprint and how their money shapes the world around them. And finally, if you'd like to join the ECCR staff team for an informal virtual lunch, bring your sandwiches along on Friday at lunchtime. Come and ask us any questions you may have, hear more about what's coming up, and join us as well for a time of prayer on Friday lunchtime. Tickets are free, all details are on our website. So thanks very much for joining us this evening. Thanks again to Michael for sharing his expertise with us and inspiring us to think about how pensions can be used as tools for good. So we're going to end the meeting now with a prayer, which I'll say. Feel free to join in at home, and do feel free to leave after the prayer is finished if you need to, but also if you'd like to pause and reflect on any of the things you've heard this evening, we'll keep the meeting open for a few more minutes. So thanks for joining, and goodbye for now. And I'm just going to read the prayer as we finished. God of love, help us to listen to what you require of us, to understand your challenge to do justice, to be moved by your call to love kindness, to see more clearly the way to walk humbly with you. Help us through prayer, conversation, and action, be better stewards of the resources entrusted to us, to shape a fairer world for all. Amen.